Okay. Bonjour et bienvenue. Merci d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. My name is Blair Elliott. I am the Communications and Events Associate at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land upon which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are all a part. I would like to let everyone know that today this event will be taking place in both French and English. We have a simultaneous interpretation service available. If you would like to use it, there is an interpretation icon found at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and choose your audio channel and choose which language you would like to listen to at today's event. You can also use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen at any point during the discussion to submit your questions, and we will get to those in the period after the panel. I would like to also let everyone know that today's event is being recorded and it will be posted on MISC's YouTube channel next week, where you can re-watch this or any of our other past events. To start us off today, I would like to introduce Danielle Benoit, who is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and James McGill Professor in Political Science at McGill University. Danielle?
Thank you very much, Blair. Bonjour à tous. Merci d'être venus en si grand nombre de façon virtuelle pour assister à cette table ronde aujourd'hui. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC, as it's known, supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as this panel today on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. I'm very pleased to chair this panel today as we think about engineering a green recovery, une relance économique verte in a post-pandemic world. This event is organized with the support of the McGill Sustainability System Initiative, MSSI, the Office of the Vice Principal, Research and Innovation, the McGill School of Public Policy, and the Office of Communications and External Relations here at McGill. So it's a big family. We work together, and ici, comme l'a dit Blair, il s'agit d'une table ronde bilingue et les deux langues officielles vont alterner. Comme Blair l'a fait remarquer, vous pouvez utiliser l'option d'interprétation simultanée en choisissant la langue de votre choix. Vous pouvez également utiliser la fonction questions et réponses de Zoom pour nous faire parvenir vos questions. Nous essaierons de répondre au plus grand nombre de questions possibles après la discussion entre les panélistes que je vais avoir le plaisir d'animer. Donc, avant de débuter la discussion, laissez-moi vous présenter brièvement nos trois panélistes que nous remercions d'avoir accepté notre invitation aujourd'hui. Sylvain Coulombe est vice-président adjoint Innovation et Partenariat au bureau de la vice-principale Recherche et Innovation. Il est aussi professeur and Gerald Hatch, a faculty fellow au département de génie chimique ici à McGill. Anja Geitmann is Dean of the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Studies, Canada Research Chair in Biomechanics of Plant Development, and member of the Executive Committee of the McGill Sustainability System Initiative. Finally, Chris Ragan is Director of the McGill School of Public Policy, Associate Professor in the Department of Economics, and former Chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. Once again, thank you for being with us today, and we'll start this panel with a really broad question for all the panelists, and later I will have more specific questions that I will really direct to a specific participants. So governments in many countries are looking for ways to stimulate economic growth following the pandemic-induced recession. Is this really an historic opportunity to pivot to a more sustainable economy and tackle the long threat of climate change? Will we be able to engineer a green recovery, une relance économique verte? And will we be able to build back better as some governments are promising? Is this the moment for reset that will stage that will set the stage for more sustainable development? So this is the main question here. Is this the moment for reset in order to set the stage for a more sustainable development? We'll start with Chris, then Anja, and finally Sylvain. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for putting together this event. Hello, everybody. So Danielle's question used the expression of engineering a green recovery. I'm a macroeconomist, but I've also spent a bunch of time in the last several years thinking about policies to deal with climate change. And I'll probably be a bit of a wet blanket on this idea. I know that there's a lot of excitement expressed by a lot of people in the policy world talking about a reset and engineering a green recovery. I actually think we should think of the recovery as a fairly separate concept from the green part. You know, this recession that we are going through, which is a massive experience in basically every country in the world, is very much an engineered recession, in the sense that it is a collapse in economic activity caused largely by either the requirements or the recommendations on the part of governments to shut down the economy and to send people home so they can be safe. I think the recovery from this is going to largely happen fairly quickly, but it's going to happen basically when it is safe to go back to work and to be working in close proximity with others. And that is going to require a vaccine. And even then, we will continue to be safe. So I think the recovery part of this is, I don't want to be too flippant or sanguine to suggest that it's going to be easy, but I think there's nothing particularly green about that recovery. I think the green part of this is fundamentally hasn't been different today than it was 2 years ago or 12 years before that, which is that there is a very serious problem of climate change. I take that problem very seriously, and I think governments are starting to take that problem very seriously. And I think we need to think over the next 30 years, not just 30 months, the kinds of things we need to do to address climate change. And I have a feeling that that's where most of today's panel discussion is going to be. I'd be delighted, actually, if we got into the ins and outs of the macroeconomics of the recession and the recovery, but I just don't feel that's where we're going to be.
So drawing a line here between kind of a short-term challenge and longer-term challenge of climate change.
Indeed.
So thank you. So Anja?
So, well, as the adage says, right, never let a good crisis go to waste, so to say. While I fully agree that the recovery will be something that will happen, and but it should be supported by governments. And here's an opportunity, right? A government could just invest into infrastructure that, you know, widens yet another highway or adds another bridge, or it could think about strategically how it supports the bigger goal. And the bigger goal is exactly that, to be able to green the economy and to go into ways that support our society in the long term. It's interesting to see that COVID has been interpreted by some as a wake-up call or a dry run for this thing that we have to grapple with, and that is climate change. While this is a nice analogy, it's orders of magnitude more complex what we have to deal with, right? COVID, all we need really is a vaccine or better healing methods. And a few companies were able to solve that, and we're in the process of getting to the end of that tunnel. However, with climate change, the approach has to be sectorial, so every sector has to contribute. It is incredibly complex, and so here government can use strategic investments in order to support that effort.
Yeah, so it's a very different take from Chris's. So No, it isn't. Okay, that's good. We'll talk about this. We'll debate this once we hear from Sylvain, and then we'll see if we can reconcile these visions. Sylvain, qu'est-ce que vous pensez donc des réponses précédentes et aussi comment vous pensez qu'on peut essayer de combiner la reprise économique avec un tournant vert, si on veut?
En fait, je suis d'accord avec mes collègues sur plusieurs points et en particulier avec Christopher sur l'idée que la transition vers les énergies vertes ou une transition plus vers une vie ou une façon de faire qui est plus durable était déjà en route. Ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est arrivé avec la COVID et je ne pense pas que c'est quelque chose qui a été défini dans la COVID. Ce qui a changé pendant la COVID, c'est que les gens, je crois, qui étaient déjà conscientisés, le sont encore plus. Je pense que les gens ont réalisé que, pas seulement les effets de la pandémie, mais tous les effets que notre société a sur notre environnement, sur les humains, on a eu plus de temps pour y réfléchir. Et je crois que la pandémie, c'est peut-être le petit kick qui va nous dire, ben, c'est peut-être maintenant le temps d'y aller vraiment, vraiment, vraiment sérieusement. Et je suis très d'accord avec Anja quand elle dit que la pandémie, c'est énorme, c'est gros, ça a affecté beaucoup de personnes, mais il y a une finalité à ça. Et il va y avoir d'autres pandémies plus tard, mais alors que le réchauffement climatique, nos façons de faire, c'est beaucoup plus gros et ça doit être fait, les changements sont beaucoup plus drastiques et ça va impliquer encore beaucoup plus de personnes, d'idées, d'investissements gouvernementaux et aussi de pensée stratégique à très long terme, parce que c'est des choses qui vont se déployer sur un très long horizon dans le temps.
Merci. So, Chris, how do you reconcile the idea of not wasting a good crisis and what you put forward, the idea of not conflating the short-term economic recovery after COVID and the long-term challenge of addressing climate change?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that. Was that to me?
Yes, exactly. So,
Good.
You said they are not, you said, you responded when I said that these are two different visions. You said, no, they're compatible. So how are they compatible?
Well, so thank you. So I think they're completely compatible because one is basically an issue over the next, let's say 24 months, and the other is an issue over the next 50 years. And we can have an economic recovery without being green, and we can have a green economy without a recovery. So the two things really are logically separate. I really liked what Anja said about climate change is far more complex than COVID. I don't hear that very often, but I think it's quite true. And as complex as COVID is, and you can look at any newspaper on any day in the last 9 months to see the various complexities, climate change is a bigger, more complex problem. It's also a more difficult problem to get people and voters to support their governments and policies. So, I think about climate change as a technological problem. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem, social, legal. There are just so many aspects to what it means to either reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the next 50 years or to adapt our societies to ongoing climate change over the next 50 years and hopefully not waiting too long. So I don't hear an inconsistency yet in the things that I've heard. I'm hoping that we will hear some inconsistencies because then we can really have a dust up. But so far, we're just all in agreement as far as I can tell, Danielle. I apologize.
What do you think, Anja?
I agree. It's a question that has different time scales, right, and different orders of magnitude, and nothing of this here is inconsistent. And I agree with Chris that the two things are not necessarily interdependent, but one could be used for the benefit of the other, right? Right. Well, that's I think it's a really nice way to start the debate to discuss these to untangle these issues. So, Chris, I will go back to you, and will be followed by Anja on this question. Will Canada's recently announced increase in carbon pricing be enough to meet our emission reductions target? Now we talk about the kind of long-term challenge of addressing climate change that you mentioned. So,
is what we are doing here in terms of carbon pricing, is it enough?
So first of all, I am a unapologetic advocate of carbon pricing. So anything I say about carbon pricing, you should put through the filter of knowing that I am a fan of carbon pricing. The federal government announced before Christmas that it would have a carbon price that was already scheduled to go to $50 per ton by 2022, that it would continue that carbon price to $170 per ton of GHG emissions by 2030. The modeling that we did at the Ecofiscal Commission and other modeling that has taken place suggests to me that that carbon price can be largely responsible for getting us to our 2030 targets. So our 2030 targets are to reduce emissions 30% below the 2005 levels by 2030. And I think the carbon price, and I must commend the government on this about putting the carbon price front and center, which means the more you rely on the carbon price, the less you have to rely on other policies, which tend to be more expensive. However, the government also announced that it would be, that its objective for the country would be net zero GHG emissions by 2050. And the carbon price that gets us to 2030 won't be the carbon price that gets us to 2050. We will need either a more dramatic carbon price, or probably in addition, we will need a whole set of other policies. And so when you hear Anja talk about public investments, I actually think there's going to be a very good discussion over the next several years about the kinds of public investments we need to assist in the development of the technologies that we are going to need to get to net zero by 2050. But the carbon price is a great start, and it'll get us to 2030 or most of the way, but it won't get us there to 2050.
You agree, Anja?
So this is interesting, right? Prior to this event, I talked to quite a few colleagues, and I'm opening this parenthesis. I really would like to acknowledge all the people who provided information to me. The economists among them agree exactly with you, Chris. Carbon pricing is the way to go. Whereas many other people, especially in the sciences, more STEM science people, say it's a great tool, but it's definitely not the only one that will get us there, right? Let's stay with the advantages of the tool. Of course, anything that goes through the money trail, right, that will hopefully work. And it has been very successful, both in the US and in Europe. It's interesting that there are various ways, of course, to implement that, either as a tax, as it has been done in British Columbia, for example, or as a carbon trade system, as it has been implemented in Alberta, as well as in Quebec. The tax has the advantage that it actually makes available resource that could then be provided to communities that are vulnerable, that actually suffer from those policies, right? From the consequences of these policies. And so there is a bit of money that could go around to support those who are disadvantaged by it. The question is, are we going far enough, right? So in Kim Stanley Robbins's latest book, which is called The Ministry for the Future, it is a science fiction about a time in the very near future when the UN creates a new ministry that is responsible for future generations. Think of that, it's a great concept. And in that book, the ministry pushes all of the big national central banks to tie their currency valuation to the amount of carbon in the ground. So it adjusts the economic system to directly favor leaving carbon in the ground. And that has, of course, immediate impacts. It's drastic. But, you know, we are in times that require drastic measures. Maybe we have to think outside of our box, right?
Thank you very much. I just shared the URL for the book with the publisher. So if people want to read the book, The Ministry for the Future, they have the URL here in the chat box. Thank you very much. So now we'll stay with you, Anja, and talk a bit, turn to the attention to Quebec. McGill is located in Montreal and Quebec. And Quebec has set out a very ambitious plan to electrify the economy. What's your take on that plan? Is it compelling? What are its strengths and perhaps weaknesses or things that we still need to think about moving forward?
I agree that electrification is definitely the way to go. Certainly here in Quebec, it's absolutely crucial to get away from fossil-based use, especially from cars that rely on fossil fuels, etc. However, we have to maybe also think worldwide, right? It's not going to be the panacea worldwide, because if you drive an electric car and you charge it on electricity that is actually produced based on fossil-based fuels, then you're just displacing the problem, right? So it might not work everywhere. That is the first caveat. Certainly in Quebec, it is an important way to go. The second one is, and that again, colleagues of mine have expressed that it's focus on electrification without thinking further is really unimaginative. Right? Because what we're really trying to do is do the same old thing, just with a different source of energy. We're still on an individual transport model that requires huge highways where everybody commutes, that has a high cost in terms of land use for the highways, as well as the surface parking. It has a huge cost on urban design because it severs communities. Just our own McDonald campus is severed by 2 large highways. No animal can get between the 3 parts of the campus. Thirdly, it is a compromise to health, right? Because of lack of physical activity, because of the actual danger of driving an individualized car. And the huge number of highways and roads create heat islands, certainly in an urban environment. So while we are at it, we definitely have to think further and think about the public transport options that could be created in order to replace the individualized car driving. Also, does everybody who has to have an individual car actually has to own it? Can we share it? All these things already exist, but they could be made available and made affordable much more widely.
Thank you. Chris, what's your take on electrification in Quebec?
Yeah, just starting before we get to Quebec. I mean, I think a very good way, I think, for thinking about addressing climate change, and it's a way that you hear many people talk about it, is sort of a 2-stage problem. One is, let's clean up our electricity systems. So let's make it clean electricity as opposed to highly emitting electricity. That's stage 1. And then the second stage is electrify everything else, right? So electrify transportation, electrify furnaces, electrify everything. So if you have a clean electricity grid and then, everything is electrified, then you're done. I think conceptually that's very good. And Quebec, of course, is in a great starting place because so much of our power already is clean, or at least relatively clean hydro. Transportation probably then is the next big frontier in a province like Quebec that has such clean hydropower. And here I think there's a tough issue, and I would just caution, I suppose, because I think the tough issue is to decide how much does the government actually have to do here versus how much is already being done by the private sector. And I think this is I don't have an easy answer to that question, but this is a world where the private sector is moving and moving quickly. And so, we see companies, of course, like Tesla that are very much headline companies, but GM, which is a much less exciting company, but 15 times the size, has said that they will be all electric by 2035, I think they've said. And so the private sector is clearly moving in this direction. I think part of that is that the private sector is moving in this direction because they see the writing on the wall, and they also know that policy is moving in this direction. But it does raise the question, does the Quebec government actually have to spend taxpayers' dollars on promoting electrification? I mean, it's one thing to spend taxpayers' dollars on electric buses. I think that's probably a very good idea. If you need new buses, you may as well buy electric buses, as long as you can get well-made electric buses, and you can. But does the government need to spend money to encourage people to buy an electric car? And one of the things, I'll just end with this, the Quebec government has had a policy in place that is still in place, which is very generous subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles. And as a general rule, I would say these kinds of policies are not very effective at encouraging use, and they're incredibly expensive. So I think there's a role for government in this world, in this policy issue, but I think government needs to be careful about it.
Thanks, Chris. Sylvain, je vous ai pas oublié. La prochaine question, c'est pour vous. Et en fait, c'est une question qui concerne encore le Québec, même si évidemment ces enjeux-là d'électrification concernent le Canada dans son ensemble et le monde. Hein? Mais on s'attarde ici sur le cas québécois comme exemple. Donc, Sylvain, est-ce que le Québec peut devenir la batterie de l'Amérique du Nord? On utilise cette expression-là, la batterie de l'Amérique du Nord. Est-ce que c'est non seulement pensable, mais est-ce que c'est réaliste?
Merci, Danielle. In fact, the reason why I lifted my little finger a few minutes ago is because I wanted to add to what was said in the previous question. So if you allow me just 1 minute, I really like the interventions. And by the way, I'm all about electrification, and not only because it's my research area. I honestly believe in it. But as Anja said, we have to also be mindful of not to displace a problem from one location to another, okay? We say a lot of negative things about fossil fuel and the effect on the environment, but we also have to we have to realize that electrification also has its own consequences. But yes, we won't use, fossil fuel, but now we will rely a lot more on materials that are extremely difficult to extract from the ground, very difficult to process, very difficult to recycle, okay? And we are already dealing with this. And lithium, for instance, we already know that we will run out of supply very soon. So there will be other additional constraints, environmental impacts of this green transition. So we should definitely ask ourselves, how green is our green transition? Okay. Bon, pour la batterie du Québec.
Oui, la batterie, ben c'est ça. On arrive à la question, mais c'était certainement une bonne réplique.
Merci. Tout à fait. Le Québec est déjà une batterie importante et le Québec prendra une place encore plus importante de ce côté-là, mais le Québec ne le fera pas seul. Je vais parler comme un ingénieur assez standard pour une seconde. Il faut réaliser l'échelle que ça représente ici. Électrifier, ne serait-ce que le Québec au complet, représente déjà un excès des capacités qu'on peut produire présentement. Okay? Donc, si on veut penser avec la batterie du Nord-Ouest ou des États-Unis, c'est quand même une échelle qui est extraordinairement grande. Okay? Quand on parle de batterie, on parle d'un objet qui doit être rechargé, qui doit avoir une capacité de stockage et qui doit avoir une façon d'être vidé, qui doit être utilisé dans certains circuits électriques. Au Québec, nous avons une grande capacité pour recharger des batteries. Nous avons une très faible capacité pour stocker l'énergie de cette batterie-là. Et nous savons que d'exporter ou de transporter notre électricité vers l'extérieur, c'est déjà une difficulté. Construire des lignes de transmission et compagnie, il y a toutes sortes de questions qui se posent avec ça. Donc, je crois qu'il y a vraiment, dans l'ampleur dans l'intérêt de tous d'électrifier, il va certainement falloir unir toutes les forces en électrification, peu importe les bonnes sources d'énergie verte qui produisent de l'électricité, il va falloir les combiner ensemble. Et ça veut dire densifier nos échanges et nos liens Est-Ouest dans les provinces canadiennes. Il va falloir aussi développer des capacités de stockage qui sont phénoménales. Et il va falloir aussi trouver des nouvelles façons de vider la batterie. Et vider la batterie, ce n'est pas juste de transporter l'électricité via une ligne électrique. Il faut trouver une façon de prendre nos électrons verts et de les convertir en produits qui vont être exportables pour le Québec. Merci.
Merci. So Chris, this idea of Quebec becoming the battery of North America. What do you think are maybe the factors here that might create some challenges here?
So I guess I think of two things, and Sylvain has touched on one of them, which is if Quebec is going to be the battery, you've got to get the power. I mean, either you can produce things here and then export them, or you can export the power. And, I was just reading the newspaper, I think it was today or yesterday, about problems that Quebec is having in building lines into the northeastern United States. Building east-west transmission grids is often talked about as something that would be very good for Canada, not just Quebec, but for Canada to reduce its emissions. You can imagine east-west grid or transmission lines from Quebec into Ontario or into Atlantic Canada, but also from Manitoba into Ontario and Saskatchewan and BC into actually Alberta. All of those would be very useful transmission lines to build, and it would help us displace coal-fired power, which produces an enormous amount of GHG emissions. But all of those are politically very difficult. And for both good and bad reasons, those things are just politically very challenging. The second problem is, and they're not impossible, they're just challenging. So one reason, for example, that Ontario would have a challenge in bringing in a transmission line from Quebec is that there's a bunch of nuclear power entrenched interests in Ontario that may not like that. So you've got to solve these sorts of policy challenges. Another one is, if you want to make the Quebec battery larger by building more hydro reservoirs, that almost certainly means building large reservoirs in northern Quebec. That gets you into Indigenous territory and forces and requires very serious partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And that's, again, not impossible, but it's very difficult and time consuming. So those are challenges that I think are really very practical, on the ground, real world challenges. Again, not insurmountable, but ones that we've got to take account of.
Yes, I think as a political scientist, I can say that the political obstacles are real. I remember when I live in Saskatchewan, where people were mentioning the idea of buying more electricity from Manitoba, because Saskatchewan has little hydropower, Manitoba has a lot. The provincial borders do matter, and there are vested interests in each province. So someone told me, oh yeah, we burn dirty coal, but it's ours. So and that's certainly an approach that we need to overcome, certainly, but the provincial boundaries are very real in this country, politically speaking, at least. Now we move to really a question about that I will direct at first at Anja, and then we'll move to Sylvain. There's talk in the US of adapting farm techniques to capture carbon in soil. So carbon capture. Is this a practical approach? And this is something you know very much about, Anja. So is it something really practical? And should Canada and Quebec, so Canada as a country, so at the national level, and also Quebec and other provinces, be thinking about it?
Well, we have been thinking and doing this for a couple of decades already. So this is not completely new in Canada either. So let me just explain. What we need to do in order to reduce the level of carbon in the atmosphere is to capture it in some way or the other. And soil is a great way to do that, because soil is actually organic matter. And if you fix that carbon in the soil, not only do you take it out of the atmosphere, but you also increase the organic matter in your topsoil, which allows for much better agriculture. So it's actually a win-win thing, right? You improve agriculture and you improve the atmosphere. The way in which this is done is to avoid methods where the carbon is released from the soil, and that will be plowing. And so it has been calculated that over the history of agriculture, about 133 billion tons of carbon have been released from soil into the air. And so what we can do if we practice so-called regenerative methods is capture back that carbon. What has to be done in order to do so is, for example, avoid plowing, avoid tilling. And these so-called no-till methodologies are more and more adopted by farms. Alberta actually gives tax credits and rebates for each acre of farm that is being treated under these methods, either zero till or low tillage. So this is being increasingly adopted. This is not without challenges though, because first of all, it depends on your local climate, because that method reduces the temperature in the soil in the spring, and so it takes longer until germination happens. Secondly, what you usually do in order to protect the soil further is you use a cover crop in between the cash crops. And so right before seeding the cash crop, you usually kill off the cover crop, and that is done with chemicals, right? Roundup and the likes. So you're using a chemical, but you avoid the carbon release. So and not without challenges overall. The other thing is that we need to consider is that what we're capturing back is essentially the carbon that was released by agriculture itself over the history. So we cannot use this as an argument, but we are capturing back the carbon that is being released through fossil fuels, right? We're never going to get there, especially that even if this happens, even if we restore all soils to a healthy level, organic level, and capture back all that carbon that was released over the history of agriculture, we'll get to a saturation, right? We can't endlessly continue. There will be a steady state. And from there on, we cannot say we can release further fossil carbon because we'll capture it back in the soil. So that doesn't work. That's one thing. The other thing is that there are actually other natural areas that are even more effective in capturing carbon, and that will be peatlands, for example. So what we need to make sure is that we don't lose peatlands and that we restore and protect those that are existing. So just to give one more example of other ways to capture carbon in the form of organic matter.
Thank you, Anja. Do you want to add something, Sylvain?
Cannot agree more. I believe that the solutions are basically to restore what we damaged and to make sure that our ecosystems are performing again. Because if we look at the technical solutions that a chemical engineer can introduce, it's essentially to reduce CO2 emission and to capture CO2. And capturing CO2 that is dispersed over extremely large volumes and surfaces is nearly impossible. It is possible to some extent, but at a great cost of energy, which will produce more CO2. So really, we have to go with the natural systems, to fight and find the right solution.
Merci. We'll move to the next question, and here we'll start with Chris. How do we ensure that? And that's I think an important topic when we talk about moving forward in terms of the transformation of the economy. How can we ensure that workers in the oil and gas sector, for example, people who are at risk here considering the current transformations, the greening of the economy, how can we ensure that they are not left behind in the context of this transition to new energy sources? Chris first, and then Anja.
Yeah, this is a super important question, and it's also very, very difficult. One of the things that that I'm disappointed in, I suppose, when I think about the policy and the political rhetoric in this country, is that we seem to have two new solitudes in this country. One is that, largely based in a place like Alberta, says that climate policy is a threat to its livelihood, that Canadian climate policy is a threat to its livelihood. And in many other parts of the country, sort of centered, within spitting distance of Ottawa, is the view that we need to shut down the oil patch. And for example, the Liberal government, I think, lost a lot of seats in the 2019 election in this province because there was a lot of people that couldn't understand why the Liberal government would have purchased the TMX pipeline. How was that possibly consistent with the same Liberal government that was introducing aggressive climate policies? So I think the truth is that we can actually have aggressive climate policies and for a while continue selling oil to a world that actually needs that oil and will need that oil for some time. But I think this becomes a highly polarized discussion. And I think over 50 years or even 30 years, Alberta's oil industry probably will decline. But I don't think it necessarily has to decline over the next 2 years or maybe even 10 years. And I think nobody really knows exactly what Alberta's future looks like in terms of how it will be able to sell its product to the world economy. But when that transition happens, and one could argue we're at the beginning of that now, I think we need to appreciate how difficult it is for an economy that is based around the production of fossil fuels, or at least a big chunk of the Alberta economy is based around that, how difficult it is to make that transition and how painful it is for the people involved. And we at this end of the country have to recognize that and recognize that when you're putting their family business out of business, it's very challenging. So again, there's no easy answer to this, but we have to talk about it a lot. And I think people at this end of the country need to show that they care about what's going on at that end of the country. And I'm not just saying that because I'm born and raised in Alberta, but it helps.
It helps. Very good. So we'll go to Anja, and then if Sylvain has something he wants to add about this or the previous questions, we can do that before we move to the last question, which all of you will have to answer. So Anja and then Sylvain.
Well, there's two things that we can do, I guess, at the policy level or strategic level for governments, and that is one, the workers that are in the oil industry or related industry have, of course, a certain skill set that is not so far from industries that will be exploding. That is, for example, clean tech, right? So now we have to think very strategically, what kind of reskilling programs are required so that the workers who might lose their job in the coming decade or so have a possibility to transition into new opportunities. The second one is, where do we locate these new opportunities? For example, can we install massive solar power farms on the brownfields of the Alberta oil sands, right? It's still engineering. So I'm not saying it's the same job, but I think there are massive retraining and strategic reskilling would be required. So a mapping exercise should be done. What are the jobs that are going to be lost if we pursue a certain avenue? What are the skills of the workers that are in these jobs? And how do these skills map onto the skill set that is required for the new industries that will develop? That is clean tech, that is solar power, that is wind power, etc. So seeing this more as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe is, I think, the mindset that will help. It's not easy to market. It's certainly not easy to those who really might have to relocate because they lose their job. But we have to think bigger picture, of course.
Tout à fait.
Qu'en pensez-vous?
Ce que je voudrais rajouter, c'est que l'hydroélectricité du Québec, du Manitoba ou de la Colombie-Britannique, ce n'est pas les seules sources d'énergie, d'électricité verte au Canada. Il y a le solaire, comme Anja parlait, il y a les marées, il y a l'éolien, il y a géothermique. Si vous regardez d'ailleurs en Alberta, il y a énormément d'anciens puits pétroliers qui peuvent être utilisés pour faire de la géothermie. Donc, l'expertise des employés, des travailleurs de l'Alberta peut être réutilisée vers ces domaines-là, qui sont des énergies, en parenthèse, propres. L'autre chose aussi qui est importante à voir, c'est que l'Alberta a une très, très grande force en pétrochimie, bien sûr. Peut-être que le mot pétro va commencer à diminuer, mais le mot chimie va continuer à être très, très significatif au Canada et partout dans le monde. Donc, c'est une main-d'œuvre qui est déjà fortement qualifiée, qui a peut-être besoin d'être un peu réorientée, mais les besoins sont encore énormes et ils vont être très grands. Parce que maintenant, quand on pense à la nouvelle économie, on pense à des nouvelles façons de modifier les matériaux, comment les faire évoluer. Il y a déjà des expertises qui sont très, très fortes dans les provinces qui sont riches en pétrole présentement.
Parfait. Donc, une vision quand même, il y a des opportunités là, tout à fait. Ben là, je vais passer à la dernière question et je vais demander chacun de tous de répondre à cette question-là parce que, bon, we started today this discussion about the issue of recovery, but so far we have raised a lot of general, I think, points that are not explicitly about economic recovery. And we have already, at the beginning of this discussion, Chris told us, well, you know, that the recession, short-term recession, we hope, in the aftermath of COVID-19 is distinct from, you know, the green shift in the economy. But if we go back to this initial discussion and really the title of this event, really, how can the ideas and proposals that we have discussed today can contribute to not just a post-COVID recovery, but really contribute to Canadian economy moving forward?
All right, I'll start out on that. I think what we said earlier, that the problems, we knew about them before. This doesn't arise because of the pandemic. I still think that the pandemic has revealed and exacerbated certain problems that we might not have thought about immediately otherwise. The pandemic definitely showed us how it exacerbated existing disparity and inequities, for example, in access to healthcare, in urban amenities, in green space. So what we should, or what governments should do while they invest into the stimulation of the economy, which has to happen either way in order to recover from the last year, how it does so while not compromising further these disparities, right? Also, while the electrification and transport is absolutely key to addressing climate change and carbon in our atmosphere, there are more opportunities. They are hinted at in Quebec's plan, for example, where they mention agriculture, indeed, where they mention buildings, where they mention built environments, but the plans are not very detailed and not very strong. So much more energy could be invested into thinking what could be done. I think one important keyword is, for example, life cycle analysis of everything that we produce, right? We have to think, new technologies are great, new methods are great, but we have to think from the beginning where they end up, right? So a novel technology is not just great because it's new, it has to be benign by design, so to say. A risk assessment has to be done from the beginning to the end. And stakeholders need to be involved in order to make sure that the measures are appropriate. Also, not everything can be solved through technology. Right? Many solutions are actually nature-based. I give you one example. New York City saved about $1.5 billion by investing in the protection of the upstream Catskills watershed instead of building expensive water treatment plants. Right? So by protecting the upstream natural source of the water, they didn't need to build these water plants. So rather than repairing, they tried to protect from the beginning. Also, so the one thing that I wanted maybe to highlight in the end is our thinking, right? And we have an economist here, and we tend to think in economical terms, and we talk a lot about the cost of climate action. What is all this going to cost us, all these measures, etc. But we must not forget about the cost of inaction. If we don't act, the costs might be much, much higher.
Thank you very much, Anja. Sylvain, do you want to go next?
Oui, peut-être, oui. Une chose qui est très importante, c'est qu'il faut penser aussi que la transition vers une économie qui est plus durable et plus verte évolue vers une économie qu'on dit circulaire, donc une économie qui est beaucoup plus respectueuse des énergies et des matières, qui a une réalisation dès le départ que les quantités d'énergie et de matière sont finies et que les réservoirs pour s'en débarrasser ne sont pas infinis. Okay? Donc, il y a une réalisation que ça c'est en développement. Ces économies circulaires, c'est des économies qui ont des boucles internes. Par exemple, un produit qui est créé aujourd'hui aura éventuellement une fin de vie, mais on ne veut pas que cette fin de vie soit juste après une seule utilisation. On veut penser que ce produit, par exemple, va être réparé, il va être réusiné et éventuellement, il va être recyclé. Tout ça crée des emplois locaux parce que ces produits-là, c'est l'entretien de ces produits-là, la mise à jour de ces produits-là, implique des emplois locaux. Donc, ça, c'est un aspect que je crois qui est vraiment très, très important à voir. Une chose que je pense aussi qui est très, très importante, c'est qu'on doit aussi penser les choses un peu plus différemment. Il faut vraiment penser en amont, parce que là, on a la chance de repenser, de faire les choses pour que ça soit différent dans le futur. Mais si vous pensez, par exemple, juste les complexes industriels que nous avons, quand nous construisons une usine, ce n'est pas pour la fermer dans 5 ans. Et la construction d'une usine peut être très longue et elle doit être, son prix va être amorti sur 30, 50 ans. Alors, ce que je voudrais, c'est qu'on pense sérieusement et en amont, avec une vision économie circulaire, oui, mais aussi de cycle de vie, qu'on va penser en amont, c'est quoi les impacts de tout ce qu'on a, ce qu'on va créer avant même, justement, de l'implémenter. Et ça, c'est générateur d'emploi, tout ça, c'est générateur. d'emploi. Merci.
Parfait, merci. Chris?
Yes, Anja reminded you all that I'm an economist and suggested that the cost of inaction need to be considered as well, and I couldn't agree more. Just in case you didn't remember before Anja spoke that I'm an economist, I'm going to say some things that will remind you again. We as economists talk a lot about specialization and the division of labor, both concepts that were found in Adam Smith in 1776. And we also talk about the assignment of policies to specific problems. And I guess I want to encourage people who are listening to recognize that we have two problems in front of us here that we've been talking about, and that they're very different problems. One problem is recovery from a pandemic recession. And the other problem is dealing with climate change. And while there are overlaps to these two things, like there are overlaps between any two problems in a complex society, I think the problem of climate change is fundamentally a different problem than the one of the current pandemic recession we are going through. And I would argue that the solution, the policy solution to climate change, is a fundamentally different set of tools and a set of different thinking than the policy solution to the current pandemic recession. So for example, thinking about the pandemic recession and how we recover, we need to think about how do we roll out vaccines efficiently. Once we even roll out vaccines, how do we correct the scarring that has taken place in the economy with the collapse of many small businesses and some large businesses? How do we make sure that daycares are safe to go back so that people can actually get back into the workforce? Those are all things that we are going to be thinking about, hopefully, when we're thinking about the recovery over the next year and 2 years. But the problems that I think we're going to be thinking about for addressing climate change are whether the government should be investing in small modular reactors to develop that technology, or they should be working on blue or green hydrogen and developing that technology, or maybe both. Maybe we need them both. And what sorts of social policies and legal frameworks are we going to use as the economy transitions away from fossil fuels toward non-fossil fuels over the next 30 or 40 years? And what sorts of political challenges are going to be created? What sorts of tensions, for Danielle Benoit's favorite sort of topic, what sorts of tensions are created in a federation, fiscally and otherwise, with this sort of adjustment? So if I were king for the day and I were setting up a government to actually address these two problems, I would set up a department of people thinking about the long run transition and all of the policies we need. And I'd be thinking about a separate department to think about how we figure out a recovery from the pandemic recession over the next, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And these would be very different people with very different expertise. And every once in a while, I'd have them get together and have lunch and exchange ideas. But for the most part, I would be practicing specialization and the division of labor and getting them because they can focus on what they're really good at. And these are two very different problems. I'll stop.
Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, I have bad news for you. Economists can't become king. It's too dangerous. So, but still, you can dream. You can dream about it. We have a bit more time before we go to the Q&A. So please keep writing your questions here. There are a couple already there. J'ai gardé une petite question en réserve. Sorry.
Can I point out the Governor General position is available?
Oh, Governor General, yes.
I believe it's available. Rumor has it that it's available.
Yes, absolutely. But you will be then representing the Queen in Canada. But it's it's a start.
Oops.
Oh, you're muted.
On va passer à la recherche. On est dans une université. Bill Gates récemment a déclaré que pour certaines industries clés comme l'acier, le ciment ou le transport aérien, nous avons encore besoin de beaucoup de recherche pour en arriver à un point où nous pouvons nous éloigner des combustibles fossiles. Sylvain, quelles sont les avenues technologiques qui pourraient permettre à ces industries d'opérer sur des bases durables?
Okay. Merci, Daniel. Très, très bonne question. Il faut réaliser que le ciment et l'acier en particulier, et aussi les transports aériens, représentent une fraction considérable des émissions de CO2 sur la planète. C'est important de dire qu'il y a déjà des gens qui travaillent très, très fort sur des solutions. Il y a des solutions qui sont déjà mises à l'échelle, implémentées dans des usines. Je vais vous donner un exemple, l'acier. Par exemple, en Europe, en particulier, l'hydrogène est utilisé pour remplacer l'agent réducteur de l'acier. Donc, ça déplace une quantité importante de CO2. Ce qu'on doit réaliser dans les industries de l'acier et du ciment, c'est qu'il y a deux sources d'émissions de CO2. Il y a vraiment l'énergie qui entre dans le procédé, donc l'énergie qui donne des hautes températures au procédé, et il y a aussi des réactions chimiques qui sont intrinsèques au procédé. Le côté entrant énergétique peut être complètement remplacé par de l'électricité. Ça a déjà été démontré et c'est en train de se faire. Donc ça, ce côté-là, c'est déjà assez bien réglé. Dans l'industrie de l'acier, du côté réaction chimique, on peut, sans complètement éliminer le carbone, on peut le diminuer de façon considérable. Dans le ciment, c'est plus compliqué. Et c'est là que je vais en profiter pour faire une petite plug sur l'Université McGill, parce qu'il y a quand même une technologie qui a été développée chez nous qui nous permet de capturer le CO2 atmosphérique et de le stabiliser, le stocker de façon permanente dans le ciment. On parle de technologies assez jeunes, mais qui sont en train de passer à l'étape de maturation. Donc, dans ces industries-là en particulier, il y a des grands efforts qui sont faits et c'est possible. Dans l'aviation, c'est un peu plus compliqué parce que l'aviation, on ne parle pas d'infrastructures qui sont attachées au sol, on parle d'infrastructures qui se déplacent dans les airs. Donc, le poids est une considération extrêmement importante. Donc, pour l'avion électrique, est-ce que c'est un rêve? Je pense que c'est en train de devenir une réalité. Il y a déjà certaines compagnies qui l'ont promis et qui ont démontré que des petits avions électriques peuvent voler. Des avions passagers de cargo, on a quand même une certaine distance de réaliser ça, mais c'est quand même dans une échelle de temps qui est réalisable. Il y a aussi d'autres carburants pour les avions. Les biocarburants, il y a des carburants carboneutres, puis il y a aussi des carburants alternatifs qui sont en développement. Donc, je dirais que pour l'industrie du ciment et de l'acier, on est très avancé. C'est une question maintenant de le faire et c'est déjà en route dans plusieurs pays. Pour l'aviation, il y a encore énormément de recherche et développement à faire, principalement pour, si on veut vraiment aller à l'électrique, de réduire le poids des batteries et d'augmenter la densité énergétique des batteries. Mais c'est faisable.
Merci beaucoup. Anja, est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose ou Chris avant qu'on passe aux questions?
Juste quelques mots peut-être concernant le biofuel. Biofuels are one of the potential renewable resources, right? And they have gotten a bit of a bad rap because in many situations they actually displaced food production, and that is of course very critical. Now the second generation of biofuels is really focused on waste products, meaning everything of the plant that is not eaten. That could be, the straw of wheat, or that could be the parts of the corn plant that are not used, as well as other bioproducts, waste products from the forestry industry. And so I definitely think it has its niche, maybe more than a niche. It has its part to deliver in terms of providing renewable energy where we needed, for example, in form of ethanol. But it cannot be a panacea, that is for sure.
Thank you very much. So we now have quite a few questions here. So let me, we'll try to have short answers, and you will tell me, I won't direct questions to anyone. You just decide after hearing the question who's in the best position to answer. First question, some studies show that the largest percentage of GHGs are produced by cement and steel production. What are the solutions here? And I suspect Sylvain might want to say something about this.
Definitely to replace the energy source at the beginning of the process, to replace fossil fuel by electricity, then the question would be, do we have access to enough of this green electricity and at the right price? Fossil fuels are extremely cheap and extremely easy to transport. So electricity at the power level that you need for a cement plant and a steel plant, you need major infrastructure that you may not have. So this is something that to have in mind. as I said before, also the process itself will involve carbon. Okay, in the steel industry, we can reduce the CO2 emission by a huge amount, and to reduce it to a very small amount. In the cement industry, it's intrinsic to the process. The carbon is there, the CO2 is there. Okay, so it's all about ways of mitigating how we handle the carbon in this case.
Thank you. We have another comment here that I think is very interesting. We are in a pandemic because of climate change. I'm thinking about deforestation destabilizing ecosystems that expose humans to diseases we are not immune to. Given this, isn't the pandemic a climate change issue? We can't go on, quote unquote, dividing issues as if healthcare, the economy, and climate change aren't part of a bigger issue. So I don't know if we want, maybe two people could actually, we start with Chris, and maybe Anja wants to say something about this too. Chris, you're first.
Yeah, so as important as deforestation is, and I think deforestation is very important, and if you'd like to read something interesting on that, Gerald Geitmann on Collapse is a fascinating book that talks a lot about deforestation problems through history and through around the world. But as important as deforestation is, I actually don't agree with the premise of this statement that climate change is fundamentally a deforestation issue. I think it's fundamental. If you were to blame climate change on one thing, in my view, it probably wouldn't be deforestation. It would be the massive exploitation of fossil fuels over the past 250 years. And deforestation doesn't help. But I would say that it's mostly about fossil fuels if it's mostly about one thing. And I think the second disagreement, I suppose, is that I think if you are going to make headway on policies, you actually have to divide. You have to actually separate. You recognize that healthcare is connected to the economy and recognize that the economy is connected to climate change, absolutely. But I actually think the only way you make progress on complex policy issues is to divide and conquer, so to speak. And I think that's what we have done. And I think that my prediction is that's what we will continue to do. And my recommendation as King is that's what we should continue doing.
Anja?
So this is interesting, right? I see it a little bit the other way around. I'm not sure whether that's completely opposite, though. I think we need to see the complexity. If we attack one thing only, we ignore all the rest and ignore the potential collateral effects. Coming back to the actual question that was posed, that the current pandemic is a direct result of climate change or deforestation, I'm not sure, right? We don't even know what this particular virus comes from, whether it comes from the bats and through the wet markets in China or in some other way. What is pretty sure is that one of the next pandemics will be a result because of humans living close to wild animals, eating wild animals, getting animals into the food system. There is a higher risk of transmission of viruses that until now were contained to animals living in some cave and now coming out, right? I saw the other day, I saw this documentary on a cave where people visited a cave where bats were flying around, right? This is not a natural encounter. This is what we as humans promote. So yes, I think we need to have a more holistic view that doesn't change that we need to attack individual things in order to get anywhere, right? Otherwise it's so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming. You don't even know where to start. So we need to start somewhere. We shouldn't prevent our state of being overwhelmed from getting us started somewhere. And there it helps, and there I agree with Chris, that it helps to actually pick out individual things, especially the low-hanging fruit and the ones where an action can have a huge impact to even get started.
Thank you very much, Anja. This question, I think, is implicitly directed at Chris because it's about something he said, I think. Is it realistic to count on the private sector when urban development has primarily been driven by the car and the drive for profit through urban sprawl? Urban design must be led by government, including people-centered communities and modern public transportation systems. Electrification in cars will not reverse sprawl. So maybe you can start with this, Chris, and Others, Sylvain or Anja, could complement your answer or maybe say something different afterwards.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for the question. It's a great question. And just so you all don't think I'm just a disagreeable person, I think agree with what the tone of this question is completely. So, I think actually one of the big challenges in dealing with climate change in the next 30, 40 years is going to be reversing the urban sprawl that we have powered, if you like, through cars and through cheap fossil fuels. I think we are going to be working toward, and this is going to come from government at some level, whether it's municipal or provincial or federal. It's going to come through government regulations and zoning requirements and planning about increasing urban densification, living less in the suburbs, driving less on highways into the suburbs. An electrification of cars won't get us there all by itself. I completely agree. And I actually think this is something we need to talk more about in this country, because I think there's still a lot of people, let's say young people, who might actually think that they are naturally going to buy a house out in the suburbs. But I actually think that will be different 20 years from now and 30 years from now. And I think if we really want to take climate change seriously, we need to put urban densification and the reversal of urban sprawl on the policy agenda in a serious way.
Wonderful. Anything you want to add, Sylvain or Anja?
I just wanted to highlight the complexity of that problem too, right? You talk about densification, Chris, and I agree, right? A city is bad enough because it takes away a green space, right? But if you have a relatively flat city, that city actually takes more or destroys more green space than a city that is very steep, New York, Manhattan skyline like. On the other hand, then there are people we should have much more green space in cities, right? Parks and places where people can actually be outside for the quality of life and the health of people, which of course displaces the high rise where another 700 people could live, right? So even there, the solutions, there's not this one solution. We have to think about how we want to live in the future. And I think one important thing is that you also alluded to, Chris, that is the commute, right? How far should we be living from the place we work? And here, the pandemic has taught us another important lesson, right? We don't actually necessarily need to commute for many of us, or at least not every day. So if many of those who could afford continue working from home occasionally, just work from home 2 days out of 5, we would be able to reduce the commute, the general commute, and the carbon that is being released as a consequence by 40%. That will be huge, right? So our ways, or what we are used to, the ways of acting, have been sort of recalibrated through the pandemic. And so this is another opportunity to which I was alluding. We shouldn't let the things that we learn through this pandemic go to waste either, right? There are other ways of operating.
I agree with everything Anne you just said.
Wonderful. Sylvain, anything you want to add to this, or we move to the next question? Okay. So we have 2 questions, last questions, because I won't take any new questions, and that gives us plenty of time to answer them. The first one, you identified yourself as someone who was born in Alberta, so I think it's for you, Chris, at least the first shot at answering the question. In order to help Alberta transition to a green economy, wouldn't it be a good idea to void the federal fiscal transfer from Alberta to the other provinces, and simply have Alberta invest the money in converting their economy to a green one to accelerate the process?
So, okay, so you can pick on me because I'm from Alberta. But everybody should know that Danielle Béland is one of Canada's experts on fiscal federalism, so he probably has something to say about this. But let me just say that I think this question is another good example of where you don't want to particularly mix 2 problems, because there's 2 separate problems staring us in the face in this question. One problem is Alberta probably needs to make some economic transition gradually away from fossil fuel production to something else. Great, we accept that as a problem. The second problem is that we have decided in this country, written into the Constitution, that we will actually redistribute income away from rich people toward poor people in the form of equalization payments from province to province. And so we have an equalization program that is not one province paying to another province, but it is federal money being used to go to have-not provinces. And that's there for a completely separate reason. Nothing to do with climate change. It's about cross-province income differentials. So we have the equalization problem to deal with that. So I think if you want to eliminate the equalization program, you can have that debate. And if you want to address the transition toward a green economy in Alberta, you can have that debate. But I don't think those two debates are going to be useful if they're mixed up, because I really think they're very different. Although
politicians like to mix them up sometimes, but that's another issue. Let's move. We have actually more questions that have appeared, but I will see if we have time to answer the new questions. But there is a set of questions. Someone asked 3 questions, and they are quite big. So I will just throw all of them at you, and then each of you can say something. You pick and choose what you want to answer. First one, what can the panel agree on as the 3 most critical drivers of a Building Back Green, BBG, Building Back Green centered economic recovery? What about incentives? That's the first question. Second question, that's a long one. What do you see as potential opportunities at the bilateral level, given the Trudeau and Biden administration's shared focus on climate action and so forth? What are the specific challenges and opportunities in terms of Canada's BBG agenda as compared to the US? So the first question is about the drivers of BBG centered economic recovery. The second one is about Canada-US relations. We just had a meeting between Trudeau and Biden earlier this week, a virtual meeting, and they talk about the Paris Agreement and so forth. And final question, and all 3 great questions. Does the panel agree that diversity and inclusion is a critical element in BBG? If so, what key measures should stakeholders prioritize? So you have 3 questions. Pick the one you want to address, and we'll start with Sylvain.
Yeah. I guess mine would be following up the meeting with Minister Trudeau and President Biden. I believe these 2 gentlemen realize how integrated our 2 countries are in many ways. And I believe that these 2 heads together should have a systems view at the 2 countries and stop being highly protective, but seeing North America as a big place where we all have to work together. Quebec has its strengths, Alberta has its strengths, and many other states have their strengths. But if we isolate them, we will never get it all together. So I believe they should think collectively as North America.
Thank you. So Anja, do you want to answer one of these questions? Maybe not the one about North America, but address one of the points that this very informed attendee raised?
Definitely. I think diversity and inclusion, that's the third question. Diversity and inclusion must be part of this, an integral part of this, right? The problem is that climate change and the effects of climate change will be felt even more in the communities that are vulnerable, in the communities that are already disadvantaged. So we have to make sure that these communities get the support, right? That is for sure. The other thing is that we have to look at resilience as well. Climate change is not just a rising temperature, right? Climate change is a much more irregular weather pattern that could destroy harvests, for example. Climate change has a lot of consequences that are much more complex, like the snow in Texas right now, right? So, which has let the electric grid fail. And so resilience at all levels needs to be reinforced. And in particular, among communities and populations that are already weakened by the conditions where they live, either because they don't have safe water to start with, because they live in areas that are first affected. Or one thing I'm thinking of is permafrost, right? A slightly rising temperature will actually lengthen the growing season here in the south of Quebec. It's great. We can grow more because the season is longer. But that slight difference in temperature actually thaws the permafrost in the north, making certain roads that were stable for decades all of a sudden sink in. So the consequences are already visible there, whereas here it might actually be positive, at least for the first few years. So these are things that we have to think of really, really seriously. And one of the important elements is stakeholder consultations and involvement, right?
Thank you. At the question buffet here, there's one plate left, and it's for you, Chris. It's actually a question dealing with incentives, and it's a concept that economists use a lot. So what can the panel, and in that case, what can Chris say about the most critical drivers of a BGG-centered economic recovery, or if you prefer, economic development? And what about incentives, the role of incentives in all of that?
So I guess I would say, and maybe this is a predictable answer for me, but I would say, let's understand and appreciate the power of a carbon price. So we now live in a country where carbon is priced coast to coast to coast. And it's either priced by the federal government, if you're in a jurisdiction where that jurisdiction doesn't have its own policy in place, or it is done by the provincial or territorial government if it's got its own policy in place. So that is part of now the pan-Canadian framework. And that carbon price will be rising. So right now, it hasn't really changed our life. We may not notice it that much, but with every passing year, that carbon price will rise, and it will rise to the point where it will, by 2030, it will be $170 per ton of emissions. And that is an enormous incentive. Okay, so some people think that incentives are things like subsidies. Well, those are other incentives, but the carbon price itself is a very important incentive. In fact, I would argue, and in fact, clean tech venture capitalists tell me that the most powerful way, the most effective way to sort of turbocharge the business plan of clean tech is a carbon price, because a carbon price, by penalizing carbon emissions, but of course not penalizing not carbon emissions, it provides a powerful incentive for anything that is not actually emitting carbon. That's a very powerful thing. And I would also add a little bit on question 2, which is, since Canada now has this, but the United States is not yet thinking about a carbon price, I think there's a scope here, let's say, for a renewed relationship between our Prime Minister and their President to actually try to pave the way in the United States for a nationwide carbon price. Because once the United States gets on board with carbon pricing, then a whole bunch of stuff will change. And part of that would be some sort of border carbon adjustments that could be shared between or uniformly created with Canada, United States, and Mexico. To help in terms of protecting business competitiveness from the carbon price. So I think I think the next few years will be quite interesting on this front.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and it's from someone who has not asked a question before, has provided some comments, but no question. It's for you, Chris. What are some proposed incentives for sustainable urban planning when municipalities are so dependent on tax revenues that they approve unnecessary development projects? For example, mega malls instead of green space, residential development on forest, and etc. I don't know if it's something, but the question is directed at you, but of course, if you don't know the answer, you don't have to.
Yeah, look, I hope somebody else has a better answer than I do on this, because look, I think this is largely municipal. I think it's super difficult because, exactly as the question lays out, you've got incentives. The city has incentives for approving development to get the stream of tax revenue, but that may not be working, or it is working maybe at cross purposes with a broader climate policy. This is going to require interaction between municipalities and provinces and the federal government. That's super hard. So I don't have an easy solution to this one at all. I think Anja does. Oh,
I'm sure she does. Anja, do you have something to add about this?
the panacea and the solution for everything and all. Of course I don't. Thanks for that ball in my court, though. I return the word to Danielle.
It was a curveball, huh?
Yeah, out of left corner.
Sylvain, do you want to also try to tackle that curveball?
Well, I'll send it back to you right away.
Very good. Well, we are out of time, and I think we got some really great questions, great exchange too. So I thank you, the three of us, Anja, Chris, and Sylvain, for your insights. And I want to.
You're on mute, Daniel.
You're muted, Danielle.
I'm muted?
Now you.
Yes, I unmuted myself now. Okay, so I want to thank, of course, our partners in organizing this this event here. That is, of course, being recorded. Someone asked this question earlier. A recording will be available on YouTube very soon, and we'll announce that on social media. So if you have friends or even enemies you want to share the video with, it will soon be available on our YouTube channel here at MISC. And I want to thank our partners, of course, today, the McGill Sustainability System Initiative, the Office of the Vice Principal, Research and Innovation, the McGill School of Public Policy, and the Office of Communications and External Relations. Merci à tous pour cette conversation très intéressante. Nous sommes reconnaissants non seulement à nos panélistes, évidemment, de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui, mais aussi à vous, les spectateurs, mais aussi les participants, parce que vous avez posé beaucoup de questions, des questions très, très intéressantes. I want to take a minute and let everyone know about some of the upcoming events that we are hosting here at the McGill Institute for Study of Canada. On March 10, Hélène Gabriel will be delivering our 2021 Mallory Lecture on, quote, resistance in the time of a pandemic, end of quote. That's the title of her talk. On March 18, Dr. Jessica Roda will be delivering our Econ Lecture on women, social media, and religious authority in North America. On April 6th, we are co-hosting an event with the Canadian Studies Program at the University of California, Berkeley, about the future of healthcare in Canada and the United States. We talked quite a bit today about Canada and the US, their relationship in terms of environmental policy, but on April 6th, we'll talk about healthcare, which is a big topic, of course, in the context of this, this pandemic, but of course, well beyond that as well. To find out more about these events and also about our institute, visit our website, which is mcgill.ca/MISC, M-I-S-C. You can also go there to sign up for our newsletter, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. It's MISCCAN, M-I-S-C-C-A-N. Thank you again for joining us. Merci, au revoir et à la prochaine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.